But welcome to all of our panelists. We've heard from most of our panelists already today, but there are two who have yet to break the airwaves, so to speak. And so, Tessius, I'm going to give you first opportunity to say hi to the crowd as our host. A brief introduction for those of you who don't know Tessius. Tessius Chigueredo is the Group CEO of Old Mutual. He's into his third career. He started out as an actuary and then is a CFA charter holder, and he's now a leader. I'm not sure the third one is as much a career. So Tessius, thank you very much for allowing today to happen. To a large extent, these things happen because of, we've heard a lot today about things that must happen and they require leadership. And so as the head man today, I'd like to give you an opportunity to perhaps share your thoughts. We have a topic. Today's session is around the idea of collaboration. How does the public and private sector collaborate to drive sustainable development? Well, the private sector represented by Old Mutual. The public sector, sorry, you've already been told you're in the public sector. Benedict, we'll hear from you a little bit later as from the public sector as well. And then just to balance things out, we have a referee in the form of economist. We know it always depends on which hand you're looking at any given time. And Roland will give you an opportunity to officiate in a small while. But allow me to introduce Tessius.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good to be interacting with you here off the golf course. And it's been a great morning so far, a great afternoon rather, and I think we are hosting a fabulous function so far with my colleagues in the room, and well done to my colleagues in the room, really proud of you. And before we go too far, I need to acknowledge my chairperson, and Ms. Lily Brand, and our first female chairperson at Old Mutual Group. She has taken over as the holdings chairperson. We were discussing earlier with other colleagues at lunch that the future is women, and men, you're gonna have to go and find what to do now. And we heard it again this afternoon from Sarah, and I think it's long overdue that women lead us into the next future. This is a fabulous topic that we are about to engage this afternoon, and I believe that collaboration between government and business is the only way forward. And a lot of people tend to think that the duties of government and business are separate, and whereas they actually do intersect quite a lot. And the issues that we face in our nations, or in particular in Africa, that are societal issues and extremely complex, require collaboration between these two. And we all need to realize that there is no challenge or a problem that belongs to one and not the other. And I think we have seen a few examples recently. COVID was one example that showed us that collaboration between government and business was the only way to serve humanity. And I recall myself sitting in my office, having to contribute in buying oxygen, medical oxygen, having to participate in the building of temporary hospitals. And I realized that I could sit back and say this is a role of government. But COVID taught us that this is now beyond government, because the lives we served during that time are our valuable customers today. So I think these two needs to really continue to work together. And so I find the theme of this summit around sustainability very key. I'm in the category of Sarah on ESG. The S give me a lot more excitement than any other bet offered. And I am not President Mbeki, but I am a proud African. And I am unashamedly and unapologetically so. And I am also proud to work for an organization that calls itself an African giant, and again, unapologetically so. It is an organization that believes that its future is in solving problems that our community that are troubling our community. And in Africa, one of the biggest challenges we have, we heard it from previous speakers, remains poverty and inequality. I was speaking to some of my colleagues yesterday, talking about what does the face of poverty look like. And we were talking that the face of poverty in Africa looks mostly young, looks mostly of color, and looks mostly women. And as an organization, we take very serious responsibility in making sure that that face of poverty is adjusted. And when I look into Africa and about youth and realize that Africa is the continent with the most youth, with 60% of Africans below the age of 30, it tells me that not only is the youth the future, it tells me that Africa is also the future. When I look into the urban migration that is happening in Africa, which is the fastest we can ever see in any continent, with our people now moving out of rurals, getting themselves involved with the economy, we have a responsibility of empowering them. We live in a world where 90% of the people have 10% of the wealth. And any organization needs to take the responsibilities to make sure that looks something we are proud of. When I look at women, and this is a statistic I saw on the South Africa economy, and it's not too different in most African countries, that if you categorize families into three buckets, one with two parents, father and mother, one with mother only, and one with father, 35% have mother and father. A staggering 60% is mother only, and only 5% have father only. It tells you that our societies are run by women. And that's why I started with my proud moment of my lady chairperson, where they run societies and they've done so for years. Why are they excluded in business? Why are they excluded in managing the wealth of the nations? So, but coming back to my pitch for Africa as I conclude, I've read so many places where it says the population of the world will be 10 billion by 2050. When I go to the other continents, I see no growth. Only Africa seems to be doubling. That's where the growth is coming from. I also read recently somewhere that tells me that the yet to be extracted mineral resources, the majority lies in Africa. I've also read somewhere very recently that tells me, the economists will confirm, that in the last decade, the discovery of mineral resources that have come through in the last decade, 40% are in sub-Saharan Africa. And for me, it just tells me the amount of potential that is there for us to solve our own problems. And this is not a government problem. This is for us, business. Our duty is not for Old Mutual to sell policies once government has created the jobs. We have to play a role. And I conclude by saying, because I have a number of colleagues that came from South Africa to empower us on managing stakeholder relationships, I want to conclude by a report I read recently from McKinsey that said 70% of CEOs believe that government the government actions have the most impact on the economic value of their businesses. Yet, only a third of CEOs have government as one of their top stakeholders. And that's where the breakdown is. And it is high time the CEOs see that government is their number one stakeholder in making sure that we move forward together. Thank you.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. Sarah, I'll perhaps just move down the row. You concluded your remarks with an interesting sentence, which was that we must become more authoritative in this space. The topic of this particular discussion is around collaboration. And sometimes those are the very hard things to balance as to when people must be told, when they must be legislated, and when they must do it because they want to. Tell us perhaps a little bit your thoughts on this idea between the very important nature of the collaboration between the investments you make and the regulatory environment in which they exist. You often will be sitting in the middle of those two discussions. How have you and how do you see these two very different sides of an economy actually collaborating on this very important issue of ESG?
Yeah, it starts with that recognition of stakeholder value. So if your focus moves from shareholder value to stakeholder value, then government as a strategic stakeholder will be top of mind. And I think Tash has alluded to it to say that government sets policy. And if we just look back at some of the examples I referenced, policy setting, so Namibia financial sector strategy, that was government pronouncing itself and government saying, we'll do certain things. So how has private sector responded? Has it held government accountable? Has it come to the party? One of those things within that strategy, if you look back, was the matter of privatization, for instance. Where were the voices to say privatization's taking too long? Okay, we finally see that not in most obvious SOEs, but at least something like MTC is plausible. But it is those types of things where you say, okay, we all recognize that, we can't just be a net exporter of contractual savings and that we need to invest in this country. But when we all make promises of what we'll bring to the table, are we keeping each other to that? Namfisa, as a regulator who was then given this task to regulate the non-bank financial sector, are we coming to the party to hold each other to account? They've just moved towards risk-based supervision, but we still see that regulation is rather prescriptive. We need to unpack how that prescriptive regulation brings about constraints to deploying capital, and there are real constraints in this sense. It's such a beautiful policy document, this Namibia financial sector strategy document. One great thing we were supposed to leverage off of compelling long-term insurers to invest a minimum of 1.75% was to say, this can unlock foreign direct investments from offshore institutional investors. And then if you have regulation that is a constraint and you do something that doesn't mirror best practice, then you don't leverage the local institutional base to attract FDIs. There are many examples like this, but I think at the end of the day, we all are focused on a better Namibia. And so we need to identify how we do that. We need to come to the party and be solutionist driven. Part of the things we've been intentional to address is import substitution in the agribusiness space. And it's sometimes so teething to have to speak to the right players, whether it's morph or whether you speak to trade and industry or, just unpacking. I mean, not so long ago, we had the retail charter. It took us quite a long time to compel South African retailers to look at their supply chains and to make sure that they, get their goods, source their goods locally and make sure that we empower further down the value chain. So these are just some of the examples. It is all doable. And I want to reference back to the example in the sustainability booklet of the wash crisis in Namibia. A few years back, the UN said the sanitation issue we have and the lack of sanitation and the solution in dry toilets is not a funding matter. It's just a lack of coordination. It's a lack of people coming into one room and having concrete outcomes to work towards. So definitely not everything is a lack of funding, and we definitely need to learn to come together, collaborate, and address and tackle issues head on.
We're going to come back to that on the second go around, because I think that you've raised a very important point. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Are you ready to take control of your financial future? Then say hello to your new digital companion, the Old Mutual app. With this ultimate digital tool, your financial journey is made easy and breezy. Seamlessly manage your portfolio and stay updated with the latest information, all with just a few clicks. And the best part? You can download and register for free today to start using it. Head over to oldmutual.com.na to discover more about the exciting features and benefits of the Old Mutual app. Welcome to the future of financial management. Old Mutual app, your ultimate digital companion.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. I want to introduce now someone we haven't heard from today, and that is Benedict Lebanda, the CEO of the Environmental Investment Fund. Benedict, welcome to the stage. Perhaps you can start out by just giving us an idea from an ESG perspective, a true fund fully committed to the ideals of ESG. Perhaps you can give us an idea of what the fund does, how it's enacted, and what the objectives of the fund are.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, to be invited to this platform. And thanks to Old Mutual for the opportunity. So I'm super excited to be here. Actually, the fund is a state-owned entity. What we do climate financing and environmental investments. So we work with a broad base of stakeholders, ranging from multilateral environmental and climate funds, international DFIs, philanthropic organizations, civil societies, private sector, public institutions. We are a Namibian-based fund, but our approach in executing our mandate is through international partnership, because that's where we mobilize resources for investment, towards climate issues as well as environmental issues in Namibia. Looking at the topic of public and private sector collaboration, I think it's an extremely important topic, which resonates very well with the fund. If we look at the challenges that we face today, inequalities, climate change, poverty, constrained fiscal space of governments, etc., you realize that we need to be bold and to be transformative. We need to be collective in the way we approach these challenges. I think it's extremely important that we work as partners. The public sector brings in, enabling environment, legal framework, they set goals and objectives, etc. On the other hand, the private sector comes in with innovation, comes in with capital, agile actions to implement, and move with programs. So that collaboration is extremely important to address issues of sustainability. But is public and private sector enough for such collaboration? So we need to ask ourselves questions. Are we missing someone within the puzzle? I think from where I sit, I'll say yes. If we look the civil society, for example, philanthropic organization, of late they've become extremely big, even bigger than some of the multilateral funds. I'm looking at the Earth Fund of Jeff Bezos, the Rockefeller's Fund, etc. I was just talking to a colleague yesterday, that a local NGO approached the EIF last week Thursday. They raised a grant funding of 2 billion Namibian dollars. And that NGO does not have an investment strategy. It's looking on how to invest in that 2 billion in portfolios that, that are aligned to their objectives. But if we start thinking about it, that 2 billion can unlock a lot of capital, can leverage more investment, can de-risk some of the institutional investments. So that collaboration is not happening at the moment, especially with those civil society organizations which have got access to that capital. So from a government perspective, I think it was about 2 years ago, we've got the INFF, not EFF, INFF, which is the Integrated National Finance Framework. So what that framework does, it guides and promotes blended financing as one of the framework to be followed. And as EIF, for a matter of a case study, we started working on SDG Namibia 1, which is a blended financing platform for de-risking private capital by crowding in different types of investors, from institutional, multilateral, international DFIs, philanthropic capital, etc. And EMAC deploy this capital towards green hydrogen assets that we are pursuing as a country. And where we are at the moment is that by the end of this month, we hope to have that fund in operation. So we've created the Namibia Hydrogen Fund Managers, which is a partnership between the Climate Fund Managers from Netherlands and the Environmental Investment Fund. So the idea is to raise about 1 billion euros for a seed capital towards the green hydrogen investments. So far, we've raised about 1 billion Namibian dollars. We do have a letter of intent from the EIB for 10 billion Namibian dollars, and we need to submit our expression of interest to unlock that. We're talking to Mizuho Bank for another facility of 300 million US dollars. That is project financing. We also received a 40 million grant from the Invest International. So that's how now blended financing now is structured. So this really, is a testimony that there's a lot of players that can come on the table beyond, public, private, and so forth, and address a common challenge that we are facing. The second fund that we are working on, of course, we work with broad-based, partners, including fossil fuel companies. We're working with one company to establish a carbon fund. A carbon fund, our timeline will be for March next year. Actually, a carbon fund is a fund that only targets assets that are backed up by zero emissions targets. It targets projects that are registered on a national carbon registry system that have gone through a process, that are also registered on a subsidiary body of the Paris Agreement. And what's good about that is that when a project is designed as a carbon project, already 10% of its capex is taken up by carbon credits, and there's a lot of international entities out there looking to offset the emission by tapping on this project and buying carbon credits on them. Most of these entities are doing that for compliance, reasons. And beyond that, what makes carbon projects more even attractive, is the new landscape of climate change. The EU is introducing the EU Green Deal, which will be in effect 2030. So what that means is that commodities and goods that are not that does not account for carbon emissions will receive a high tax premium and become competitive, of course. But if there is a carbon-based products, commodities that are traceable, that are verifiable, those goods, when they enter the EU, they'll receive incentives in terms of addressing environmental concerns. All this requires very good ESG systems that are of international standards and accredited standards to put together and to facilitate. And that is one of the funds that we are busy, in terms of innovative with I can't mention our partner at this point, but at the right time we will be able to unveil our partner. So we'll start with the $5 billion Namibian is a fund, and we hope to grow that twofold through leveraging and recycling over a period of 15 years. Also on the NGOs that I mentioned, I see one fund manager looking at me, but I can't reveal at the moment. But I think we'll be in a better situation in the next few days, and we'll be able to engage with different partners and see how we can assist and collaborate with other institutions. Thank you.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. It's powerful to hear from our representatives that we're viewing as being from the public sector today that funding is not the problem.
Yeah,
there's money; those are staggering amounts. It also doesn't feel like international legislation and standards are a problem. There's new compliance regulations coming down that will create incentives. So, Roland Brown, why are we not perhaps seeing as much private and public sector collaboration as it would seem would make sense? The stage is set. What are we lacking?
Well, I think there is quite a lot of public-private sector collaboration, but there can always be more. I think something that's quite poorly understood here generally is that public sector and private sector are not they're not opposites of one another. They're totally different. And the focal points of public sector and private sector are totally different and should be totally different. So private sector's focal point is micro. Private sector, once you become as big as mutual, maybe you start to look a bit bigger picture. But for the vast majority of private sector, the focal point is fairly micro. It's the handful of employees you have. It's ensuring that your income exceeds your costs. It's relatively basic, small picture stuff. And lots of that put together becomes the big positive macro. And if you look at, so Sarah talks about venture quite a lot. And if you look at, for us, a big red flag on a venture project is if somebody comes to us and say that they want to do this because they want to contribute to Vision 2030 or something like that. We say that's not your job as a micro enterprise. Your job as a micro enterprise is to provide a good or a service that you have clients that want for a price that's greater than the cost of producing it. If you don't get that right, none of that contribution to Vision 2030 and all of those grand ambitions go anywhere. And your focus should start there. Now, scaling that up across, the many business people and private sector players becomes a macro story where you have national employment, national GDP, national exports, and so on. And that's really the focus point of the public sector. And that should be the focus point of the public sector. And this is often where arguments around something like an Air Namibia is very badly thought out, because private sector people will look at Air Namibia and go, Air Namibia is making losses, financial losses at micro level, and therefore should be closed down. That's an extremely poor argument, because the owners of Air Namibia should be looking at what is the net contribution of Air Namibia to the macro, not just that specific micro. And in Air Namibia's instance, it may well have been the case that the net contribution to the country was much bigger than the financial cost of the losses that it ran, in the sense of it brought large numbers of business people to the country, tourists to the country, etc. And government's the only entity really that should have the macro focus first. Private sector should have the micro focus first and the macro focus second, and public sector should have the macro focus first and the micro focus second. Now, one of the big weaknesses of private sector is that they exist, and private sector tends to work best in a relatively free market. And free markets are great, and markets in general are great, and amazing things, but they are imperfect. And markets, if left to their own devices, often do create these market failures, these what economists call externalities. And those market failures may be various different things. So it can be environmental degradation, in the interest of profit seeking. It may be something like wealth accumulation in the hands of a very small group at the expense of the majority and so on. And from a macro perspective, that's something that's undesirable for kind of obvious reasons, for long-term sustainability, but also for other reasons. And public sector's role in ensuring that those market failures are not just allowed to perpetuate, and that there's policy and so on in place that ensures that the minority can't benefit at the expense of the majority and things like this. That's of enormous importance. And I think the interesting thing around market failures for me is that not all market failures are created equal. And I think across different jurisdictions, different market failures matter more than others as well. And whenever we talk about ESG, we talk about it in these very broad, very generic terms. ESG important. And yes, it is, but not the E, the S, and the G all matter exactly the same or in exactly the same manner, and not exactly the same across every jurisdiction. And if you look at the market failures in our part of the world, I don't think the majority of the market failures are E-linked. The G is like a binary thing, right? You must just get governance right. If you don't get governance right, you're not getting third-party capital for the most part. So that's very binary. But E and S, we sort of treat these as very equal things. And in my mind, in Namibia, on the E side, we're not doing badly at all. On the S side, we have a number of market failures, and we haven't sorted out those market failures very successfully at all. And this is something that should be a big part of the ESG focus in Namibia, is how do we sort out the social part of our market failures. The other thing, of course, is that you don't just want to focus on negative externalities. There's huge numbers of positive externalities as well, and often private sector can bring those out as well. And I think our tourism industry is a very good example of a environmental positive externality, where our tourism industry gets very little credit and limited sort of compensation, let's say, for the great things that they do for the E part of the ESG in Namibia. And I think, often when we talk ESG, we focus on the things that we're getting wrong. But I think on that specific front, Namibia's got very, very good E stories to tell. That doesn't mean that you want to now let that slip in any manner and just focus on the social part. But I think for us and in our specific instance, the importance of that collaboration is around how do we ensure that we don't allow these market failures to perpetuate where there's this huge social implication of that.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Stay 2 steps ahead of life with Old Mutual Funeral and Life Insurance. While funeral insurance covers the costs of the actual funeral, life insurance gives you peace of mind, knowing that your family will be taken care of when you're no longer around.
Get ahead of life with Old Mutual Funeral and Life Insurance. SMS cover to 66522. Speak to your Old Mutual financial advisor or broker, or visit oldmutual.com.na. T's and C's apply. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company, Namibia Limited.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. Nicole Martins, Head of Stewardship at Old Mutual. For the last 7 months or so, you've had to wander into boardrooms and explain to people how the world is going to be in the light of an ESG approach and a sustainable investment approach. What I'm interested in is perhaps a very narrow bit of the topic that we're discussing today, which is collaboration. By its very nature, very few of the problems we're addressing can be done by a single corporation, a single government, a single industry even. how have you experienced the challenges and perhaps some of the solutions to this idea of collaboration?
Yeah, great. Thanks. And it's always a challenge to try and add on when you've got such prolific speakers. So thank you very much. I think what is important to understand and why collaboration is so crucial is because no entity operates in a vacuum, right? When we talk about Old Mutual Investment Group as an institutional investor, we don't exist without companies to invest in. They don't exist without a stock exchange, which doesn't exist without policymakers and regulators, and none of it works without clients at the end of the day. And everything that we do impacts the people who we represent and people we don't, right? So every decision that we make has real impact for real people every day. And so it's ridiculously naive to think that we could fix all these problems, address these things without talking to anybody else and doing it by ourselves. And I also think what we have found is that the hesitation around collaboration, I'd say from a public and private sector collaboration, it's mainly technical. They are very different beasts and they are structured differently. Like's been mentioned, we have very different mandates usually and timelines that we work on. Sort of that tragedy of the time horizons comes into play. We also have very different capacities to act and frameworks within which we operate, and the speed at which we can work. That also affects things. Within our own industry, I think one of the problems or the biggest challenges that we face in terms of trying to collaborate on issues is that we lose sight, we're a bit myopic sometimes around being competitors instead of being focused on where do we need to partner, where is there an issue that affects all of us regardless, and that there's no additional little upside to be gained by keeping this relationship to myself. And I think it's helpful to talk through it in sort of a practical example. So let's say we're looking at something like this transition to net zero, right? And I like the idea of it because it's an interplay of all the E and the S and the G. So fully agree, you need to get the G right first, because if you don't have the G, you can't address E or S issues. So let's say everyone's applying best practice, everyone's got their king codes and we're great. Then we look at this issue, we say, all right, well, we have an environmental issue that we are attempting to address, but it has severe and significant social implications, right? We see that when it comes to something like access to energy, the whole market, most economic growth is going to depend on the use of some sort of energy, but where that energy comes from is sort of irrelevant. But there are trade-offs. There's always a trade-off. So if you're working with companies and we go in as Old Mutual Investment, we would say, hey, we're a responsible investor and we're a shareholder in your company. We own a whopping 3% of you. They're not really compelled to listen to us. It makes a big difference if we go in with our peers in the industry and say, look, now this room is 25% of your ownership structure. That makes a big difference. It makes an even bigger difference if we can go in with a supportive public sector and say, dear company that operates in the private sector, we acknowledge that there are some changes you need to make. We also recognize that it's not your responsibility to solve for all social ills. And so the risk that you might face in terms of the fallout from a change in the way you do business and the collateral damage that does come from that, that's what public sector is here for. And they're willing to step that up and create that social safety net so that you can make those decisions and not have to try and mitigate against angry communities in your strategy. So it's really, we're all trying to solve the same problem, and trying to do it in pieces or in isolation, it's actually just illogical. It doesn't really make any sense. So from our side, what we're really trying to do is to encourage these kinds of conversations. We're engaging with the companies in which we invest. We encourage them to collaborate with their industry peers, with policymakers and regulators to lobby in a constructive and positive way. We encourage we were engaged with policymakers and regulators through our industry bodies. We try and make sure that international best practice principles are applied in an appropriately nuanced and context-specific way. And then we try and get everybody in the room at the same time. Civil society is really useful for that. Academia is really useful for that. Usually academia will follow or will lead technological development by a good couple of years. So it also behooves you to sort of have those relationships. So I really do think that what we have seen is that there is a shift happening where the industry and various stakeholders across the market are becoming more and more open to the idea of working together, understanding that it's going to require some compromise. But it's really the only way that we can do this. And I think the why we're seeing it start to come to the fore is because these issues are subject to global mandates, right, and global commitments that are made on an international stage, and those are made by the public sector. So your government made that commitment, they made a promise to reach a specific target, and they actually can't do that by themselves. It has to be all of us or none of us get there. And I think there's just a growing recognition of that, and that's starting to build a lot of momentum now.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Yes, Nicole's mentioned something, I think you called it the timing tragedy, the tragedy of time horizons. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, because it occurs to me as we contemplate many of these issues. We've spoken about different focus points, different agendas, different measures, different responsibilities. As a CEO of an organization, more often than not, we're driven by reporting time horizons. In an American context, it's become quarterly, where you have this 3-month view of the world, and your share price rises or falls based on a quarterly report that can impact billions. And of course, Sarah, that affects your investments, and you have to explain to your board why the numbers are down. And yet we are talking about issues that may take decades or even centuries to solve, and they've certainly been centuries in the making. As a CEO, how do you grapple with the tragedy of time horizon?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but balancing today and tomorrow is a very difficult job. And so often the shareholders want us to produce what they want to see today. At the same time, I need to prepare this organization for tomorrow. And balancing that, I can tell you, is the most difficult thing. But this is the leaders we need today that are futuristic in thinking. And my apologies to the South Africans in the room. I want to quote Eskom. Eskom is load shedding started 10 years ago, actually, not now. And companies today, if I were to add up how much they're using for diesel to keep themselves on, but they knew this problem from 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, as companies, we decided not to invest in this thing. It was a government problem. It's not ours. Today, that diesel is eating on our profitability big time. And so at what point should CEOs realize, and I'm back here in Namibia, we have challenges of water. And we have seen just slight challenges of it now. This problem will be here 10 years down the line if I look after just today and not start to think about tomorrow. And tomorrow the problem will be 10 times bigger than what it is today. That's why this topic of collaboration is extremely important in my view. And I agree with Roland that alone as an organization, you gotta be micro, but together as CEOs, we have to be macro and see how we can balance both the short-term horizon and the long-term.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Sarah, someone who deploys a lot of capital in that space, I'd like to hear your views on you want to see short-term results, and by short-term, perhaps in a year or two, but we are balancing and investing in economies that require 5 to 10, perhaps to 20-year horizons. And how do you balance that in the way you assess your investment strategies?
Yeah, so fortunately, I am able to take long-term views. Pension fund liabilities are long-term, and that's why in part of our advocacy, we want to drive that home, right? That there's no better investor out there like long-term insurers and pension funds to take that long-term view. If we're going to match our liabilities, we can have that 15, 20, 30-year horizon because it just better matches our liabilities. But being intentional is critical, and I liked what Roland said. He said sometimes we speak about this so broadly. And just from hearing what Benedict said, so in some of our portfolios, we're really addressing formalizing the charcoal industry in Namibia. And so there is a big carbon sequestration opportunity. So I'm actually very interested in all the funding that's available that can come into those portfolio companies. And I want to challenge him, Benedict, because last year, September, we sat on a panel and I said to him, well, I've got investments out there that your money can go into because you're interested in reporting immediate impact. I've de-risked this for you, even though I shouldn't have as a pension fund. Bring your money into this and then you can report immediate impact. So I think it's really just about us all being intentional. He was called the silent executor earlier on, Wilhelm Wittmann, senior portfolio manager for a fund where Old Mutual, when GIPF anchored that Old Mutual fund, right? That fund is still accepting capital. Benedict must push some of his funding there. That's a climate resilient. That's a climate resilient fund. So I just think we maybe we're not speaking to each other. There's already so much we can latch on. We all may be doing things on a silo basis, but I think there's already so much we can latch onto, and we just need to be intentional.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Hey, where are you going in such a hurry?
I'm on my way to Old Mutual to make a funeral claim.
Haven't you heard? Old Mutual now has a new solution for making funeral claims on WhatsApp.
Really? That sounds amazing. How do I get started?
It's easy. With Old Mutual funeral claims on WhatsApp, you don't have to go far to make a claim or submit documents. Simply save our number, +264 81 166 8365, and WhatsApp us today. Old Mutual, here to help you do great things every day, even in the toughest times.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
All right, Benedict. Didn't do your homework. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, because Sarah said something that occurs to me often. We get to engage with multiple industries on an ongoing basis at both government and the private sector, and we hear the voices from everyone, and it's a lament that I've heard expressed and expressed myself many times, is we're not talking to each other. Mm. So when that happened last year's panel discussion, how hard is it to have these conversations? Is it a lack of opportunity? Is it a lack of intent? Is Wilhelm not answering his phone?
Yes, and it's a very good challenge, Sarah. There's lots of funding, international funding out there. I think one of the challenges is that, especially in our sector, this funding comes with a lot of conditions. Yeah? So you find funding that will access, for example, $500 million, and we will be conditioned to invest it in non-revenue generation assets. This could be guarantees, interest subsidies for loans, etc. And that there's a conversation that we should have with some of the institutional investors to reduce the cost of capital through those guarantees. Yeah. The challenge that Sarah gave me last year was to buy one of her portfolio. So we looked around. We're still working on that, Sarah. There's a lot of opportunities. We understand where we are working in the DFI space. Our mandate does not require us to be profitable but sustainable. And that a particular entity that Sarah referred to, we have given it a mandate for climate financing 2 months ago. So that is a big step to the right direction. So what we've done is we realized that there's a lot of space within the SME sector, especially when we look at green financing. It's underserved. So we started an SME blended financing facility, which with about 92 million Namibian dollars. And who else is better than Congaland to manage that facility? And that's the same entity we're talking about. So we are slowly moving to that direction, Sarah. Sorry, I didn't share these notes with you, but I think there's a lot to discuss. We need to really come together on the table and share more notes. We are also talking to commercial banks at the moment, mainly looking at a guarantee facility for $150 million. So what we're witnessing is a revolutionary movement, when it comes to urban and peri-urban agricultural systems. There's a lot of, agricultural lands around Windhoek, plots that have been divided for 10 hectares, 5 hectares agricultural production units. So is Swakopmund, Rehoboth, Ochwarongo, and Keetmas. So the good thing about this kind of projects from where we sit as EIF is that they are very low on emissions. They're closer to cities. And that, food makes up 10% of global emission because food does not have a long shelf life, so you reduce all those emissions. So what I'm getting to is that we'll provide guarantees, partial guarantees for those SMEs to access up to $5 million Namibian dollars, and we're targeting our mothers, women, and sisters as 30% of the portfolio, at least minimum, and about 50% of it, youth target, and the rest is open for any applicants. So I think that information is also not known, and it's because we hardly have platforms for sharing what's happening within the country, as much as we have about 2.5 million people. We need more platform to discuss and exchange these notes.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Let's perhaps talk about another aspect of this, which of course is timing. And sometimes timing is pure luck, and sometimes it's misfortune. And we now sit in a situation where we would have, as a country, been a forerunner of E, because E was relatively easy for Namibia, and then we found some oil. So let's talk about oil, Roland. We've, in your presentation, it became pretty clear that there's really one Hail Mary pass for long-term sustainable growth for the country, and that is the one thing that the world's decided is now not in the world's interest. How do we bridge those gaps?
Well, I think first and foremost, the world has definitely not decided that oil is a thing of the past. The world has decided that we should try to move towards more sustainable, on a net basis, energy sources. But many of the same countries that have made those decisions that we should be moving onto a more sustainable environmental path are far from switching off either their own oil production or own oil consumption. And I think one of the great evils of ESG is that it's applied sort of equally to countries and people, sort of irrespective of where they are on the development ladder. And, I think it would be great if there were ways that we could become, that we could kind of catch up on development that were, sort of 100% ESG approved through and through. But I think that's a bit like a unicorn, really. They, nice in theory, but they don't really exist in practice. And I think from Namibia's perspective specifically, the nature of the oil that we potentially have and the nature of the process of extracting that and the nature of the parties involved in that put us in a relatively very positive position as far as oil producers and potential oil producers go. We always talk about how the environmental benefits come with costs and social benefits come with costs and so on. In this instance, the direct direct environmental costs, I think, are pretty negligible. The indirect costs of the emissions are something else, perhaps. But it's not as if we will be producing oil that would otherwise not have been, or that oil would have otherwise not have been utilized had we not produced it. So our net contribution to global oil emissions and carbon emissions resulting from oil, I don't think is something that would really move the needle. More than that, I keep coming back to the social side of things, and I think the potential social benefits that would come from material increase in national wealth, I think are absolutely astronomical if applied correctly. We always talk about Namibia being one of the most unequal countries in the world, and it's difficult to see how you remedy that in a manner that results in everyone being more wealthy in any sort of condensed sense of time without a shock like this. And the great fear that we have around some of the other stuff where there's a very strong environmental focus is, as I've repeatedly said, I don't think Namibia has an environmental problem per se. I think on a net basis, we're a net carbon sink most likely. I don't think we have brilliant data on it, but we're certainly not a major net emitter by global standards, and many other environmental things I think we feature fairly favorably. And it seems that many of our ESG type of activities are very focused on environment, but that's not where our problem lies. So we're sort of trying to solve environmental problems for other countries in the world for very little actual benefit to Namibia. I won't say specific things because Benedict is within striking distance. But, we're very focused on things that solve environmental problems that are not our problems. They're not caused by our hand. And the social benefits, so the compensation, for example, that we get from that, or the job creation, the wealth creation for Namibians that we get from some of these things is actually very minimal. And so we're solving somebody else's problem, and they're not in turn helping us to solve our problems, which are much more on the social side. And I think that, this should be one of the things that we take up in all of these negotiations around who puts solar panels where in Namibia and so on. It should be, what are we actually getting back for this as a nation? We're giving you a national park, we're giving you vast amounts of land, we're giving you access to solar irradiation, which is supposedly some of the best in the world. I mean, if it's the best in the world, it should have some value. So how do we get something back for that and ensure that, and use that to apply to solve our problems, which are, as I said, social more than environmental.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Are you ready to take control of your financial future? Then say hello to your new digital companion, the Old Mutual app. With this ultimate digital tool, your financial journey is made easy and breezy. Seamlessly manage your portfolio and stay updated with the latest information, all with just a few clicks. And the best part? You can download and register for free today to start using it. Head over to oldmutual.com.na to discover more about the exciting features and benefits of the Old Mutual app. Welcome to the future of financial management. Old Mutual app, your ultimate digital companion.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
So, Nicole, many of the investments you guys would have made would have been quite regional of nature, as opposed to being, obviously, Roland's focusing heavily on a Namibian context. You would be having conversations that would be perhaps a little broader, subcontinental, perhaps even international. I'm interested to hear your reaction to Roland's views.
So am I. We're at the end of the long day, and so I need to be very conscious and diplomatic in my response. But I must warn, I have been triggered by some of the things that Roland said. But I think that's your thing, so it's cool. You like poking, it's good. So I'd love to talk about this. So there's a couple of things that I just think are so important to just lay bare. So the first point I really want to pick up on is this idea that climate change is not our problem. So arguably, African nations and Namibia particularly has contributed disproportionately little to the extent of the problem. But that doesn't change the fact that we are severely impacted by the issue, right? Sub-Saharan Africa specifically is set to experience double the global average when it comes to the global temperature increases. That means that if the global temperature increases 3 degrees, in Namibia it will be closer to 6 or 8. That means there's no more agriculture in Namibia, right? It's a significant impact. So it's not our problem, it's 100% our problem. Also, I think one of the biggest disservices we do for ourselves in this industry is that we talk about ESG issues as if they exist in little silos. And none of them are like that. They are infinitely complex and they are interconnected and they all touch one another. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. There are within those 169 different objectives and they all connect. And when we talk about addressing the climate emergency, the climate crisis, because that is what it is, it's not because it's the only ESG issue. It's because it's the most pressing, the most time sensitive, and because it exacerbates every other issue, right? If you care about poverty, you care about unemployment, you need to care about climate, because if we don't address the climate crisis, economies start to change structure in a significant way, right? And then you don't get to take advantage of the new jobs that can be created in new industries because you've put all your resources into sunset industries, right? So that's a huge problem. We also see everything when you talk about gender. We open this with these beautiful sentiments about how women are the future. We have all the research that shows us that specifically in Africa, in emerging markets generally, but in Africa specifically, when temperatures increases and drought increases, it's the women who go to fetch water, who stop going to school, who stop going to work, so that they can travel further and further to find water. So if you care about gender, you care about climate. You have to care about these things. The climate crisis is a water crisis, is a gender crisis, is a poverty crisis, is an inequality crisis, is the same thing. So it is all of our problem. It is all of our problem. And I think it's really important that we understand that. And like I mentioned previously, it's often not the most tangible thing, it's not the most palpable for us, but it is in every way relevant. That's one thing. Then the other thing I think is about this idea of the economic benefit of oil. So I'm not a Namibia expert or an oil specialist, but I will compare it to this idea of gas in South Africa, right? And when we look at the climate crisis, which is a global problem, we share one atmosphere, right? So when Namibia emits or South Africa emits emissions, those emissions don't stay just on top of that country. It's dispersed globally, right? So everyone's contribution is everyone else's problem. And when we look at what international authorities like the International Energy Agency or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say, they say that we need to get to net zero by 2050, not because then everything's fine, but because then we avoid the worst possible scenario. The worst possible scenario, you mentioned earlier that we're looking at getting to 10 billion people on the planet. At a 4-degree global temperature increase, the planet can only sustain 1 billion people. That is a huge cut, a coal that will need to happen. Right? So it is a massive issue. And all of those authorities say that in order for us to get to that point, that net zero point where we avoid that horrible scenario, there is no new oil and gas ever. From this point and forever, there is no new oil and gas. What we have, what's out, what's already tapped, we can use in a decreasing, sort of declining fashion. And rapidly, there's going to be some that's left, and that's just too bad. We're going to have to leave it in the ground. But there's no scenario where the planet is helped, and so where the global we and economies and people are helped by adding more. So I would say from this kind of perspective, and I know that it's terrible because you see this opportunity, and it seems hellishly unfair that the developed world has created the problem and they've got to their developed status by using these resources and are now telling the emerging markets they're not allowed to follow the same path. But I would also argue that that would be really unfair if there were only one path, but there isn't. And you've just mentioned the opportunity of solar, for example. If we just are willing to take a different path and not fixated on the idea of following the same path that got us into the problem in the first place, the opportunities are so much greater. And I think when you look at it like that, the most unfair part of the whole situation is not that we're not allowed to burn as much coal or use as much oil. The unfair part is that we're taking so long to just get going that we're robbing ourselves of the opportunity to solve the problem and become leaders in this space.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
I have to latch on there. It's fine balancing act, right? It's not easy conversation, and that brings out some of the nasties in terms of morals, ethics, unfairness, and I think to try and play devil's advocate or to arbitrate what has happened there between the two strong opposing, it's just fine, opposing views. And it will bring you back to the S again, and I guess it's. I don't even know where to start or how to deem it. But what often tends to happen is, even if we move away from traditional fossil fuels, it is so much more difficult for African countries to embed the technology required to adapt to going green. So it's almost that double layer of it being unfair. So there's a lot we have to think about when we push towards the one spectrum. It's the same thing that appears when you talk of artificial intelligence and machine learning being based off a white male and the ethics behind that to say, well, there's more diversity. So it really requires this intricate balance. But there is an opportunity in that, if we can attract capital because there are offsets with other opportunities, we shouldn't shy away from that and say, well, we didn't cause environmental issues, we shouldn't focus on it. Maybe yes, as a government we shouldn't spend money to it, but if we can have carbon sequestration by attracting capital that goes elsewhere, we should totally do it. But just coming back to green hydrogen, for instance, as well, someone has to invest in the technology to make sure that these things are not white elephants tomorrow. So I almost want to ask ourselves, are we taking a holistic look at some of these things? And maybe I want to Tasha's to come in here. If I look at what ASISA in South Africa has done, I think they've sort of compelled a whole host of JSE companies to allocate a certain amount of profits towards certain things like infrastructure development. And I think if I look at what we need in Namibia, it would be interesting if I know some establish welfare foundations and the like, but if we collectively came together to say, we will always struggle to have an angel network within Namibia because, our government doesn't have the funds to maybe, like in South Africa, have a IDC where NIDA can just help with enterprise development. But we really have to be intentional. And you can't argue. I used to argue and say, well, venture capital in Namibia especially is probably just SME funding, and it's not VC in the true sense of adaptive technology. But just look at Jabu. Jabu is addressing the informal sector through a ledger system of their order and processing and logistics system. And it was very unfortunate that that company got funding through one of our venture capital funds in San Francisco, Quiet Capital. And they said, yeah, look, they had to go all the way there to get funding. And how many other Jabus could there possibly be? So we have to recognize the role technology plays in some of these other things. Like you can't just say we need to immediately adopt certain spectrums of going green because you need technology. You can't just say we must do solar. One of Eskom's big problems is the grid and what solar does to damage the grid. You know, you need to be prepared. So it's a much bigger and complex situation, and we should maybe, as Roland was saying, more talk about integrated mix for now than just being on the one side, because then I do believe the S will also weigh down as much as they all, intricate and intertwined. Yeah.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
Stay 2 steps ahead of life with Old Mutual Funeral and Life Insurance. While funeral insurance covers the costs of the actual funeral, life insurance gives you peace of mind, knowing that your family will be taken care of when you're no longer around.
Get ahead of life with Old Mutual Funeral and Life Insurance. SMS cover to 66522. Speak to your Old Mutual financial advisor or broker, or visit oldmutual.com.na. T's and C's apply. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company, Namibia Limited.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023.
What I'd like us to perhaps do, Nicole, and I'll perhaps start with you. I'm conscious that we've said many times how complex this is, how broad it is, how incredibly complicated and difficult it is. But it is the sum of many small actions that take any crowd of people anywhere. Perhaps I can ask you, just in 60 seconds or less, what are you going to be doing in the next month specifically to target this particular topic of trying to create better collaboration between the private and public sectors?
Great. So in the next month, we're rolling out our stewardship strategy, working with target companies in our portfolio that have got very pressing environmental, social, governance issues, and encouraging them to make improvements on those. It's all about setting a target and putting in place a plan, and at the same time working within what the national objective is and what the government's sort of plan is there and the policies that are in place. So one of the things that's a collaborative action that we work on is just asking those companies to reconsider being part of industry groups that lobby actively against policies that would progress the market. So that's something where it's us asking you to say, take a collaborative platform you already belong to and try and make it constructive as opposed to destructive. So that's the thing we're doing at the moment.
Thank you. Roland?
So I apologize for triggering you before, but I know that's the first part of my statement. What I'm going to say now will probably make it. So I think
between these two.
He's not the silent assassin.
Yeah. So I think what we've focused on and what we have a keen interest in is ensuring that the social side of things, that households of incomes, that in the event that you do have a continued climate slippage that's not at all caused by us in Namibia and in this part of the world to the greatest extent, that households rise above deciding whether it's the women or the men who go to get water, but that is no longer the key consideration. And so often when it comes to these things, we act as if the status quo is people will be critically poor and the environment will change. And that's exactly what's wrong with the whole argument. We need to create environments where we lift people out of poverty so that they are much less vulnerable to climate change that we don't cause and that we only contribute to in a relatively minor manner. So that's what we will continue to do. We'll continue to push for job creation, for policy that enables job creation, for policy that helps to put food on people's tables, for policy that helps to ensure that public sector steps in where private sector is failing, helps to redistribute funds through tax systems and similar to ensure that people aren't left behind and at the mercy of climate change caused by other people. That's what we'll continue to do on the one side. On the other side, we'll continue to lobby for Namibia becoming an oil producer, because the idea that Namibia producing oil is somehow going to spark additional demand for oil is absolutely ludicrous. The idea that if Namibia produces oil, more oil will be consumed globally. That's not how global supply and demand works. There will be the same amount of oil consumed, irrespective of whether Namibia produces it. The big question is, can Namibia produce it as cost effectively or cheaper than the next cheapest producer of oil? And ideally in a manner that's more environmentally, socially, and governance friendly than how it's being produced in the Middle East, how it's being produced elsewhere in the world. And so we will absolutely continue to motivate for that, continue to push for that, to try to ensure that while we transition away from oil, it's done in as sustainable a manner as possible, as environmentally friendly a manner as possible, and as developmentally friendly a manner as possible. And so we will absolutely continue to do that.
Benedict, if I could ask if you could just adopt the Nicole version of 60 seconds as opposed to the Roland version of 60 seconds.
I think as a public official that is working for a government that's pursuing green hydrogen and oil production, I think I'll have a balanced view of the two. Yeah? Why am I saying so?
But remember, because I'm going to stop you now. The question isn't on this debate.
Yes.
What are you going to do to promote collaboration? You guys have animals running around farms getting killed. You've got to go and talk to farmers to please stop. Exactly. What are you going to be doing to increase collaboration?
Yes, next few months, we're working on green hydrogen investments. Of course, our ambitions and objectives is from an economic point of view than from decarbonization, because it brings the jobs that Roland is talking about, prosperity, etc. There's a lot of work that we'll be doing to raise awareness of green hydrogen. By the way, it's not a new technology. The biggest green hydrogen plant was developed in 1973 in Zimbabwe, and it's been running since then, producing fertilizer, producing ammonia, running on hydro. And this is a proven technology that has really changed the agricultural sector of Zimbabwe. Secondly, we'll also be advocating for the application of a UN principle called common but differentiated responsibility. What that means is that it calls for emitting countries with high, deep pockets of capital to lead the transition, while developing countries such as us, we should use all our resources we have, including oil, to transition to green production systems. Thank you.
You are listening to a rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. Sarah.
Yes, continued advocacy, and I think SDG 6 is heavy on my heart. I want the concept of carbon footprint to move towards water footprint, carbon taxes, water offset taxes. So really getting people around the room, just as we rallied behind energy, that we do so when it comes to the water and sanitation sector.
Thank you. Tess is host. I'll allow you to have the last word.
Thank you. And I hope I can get 2 sets of 60 seconds. The first one really is, I'm not going to invite myself to the debate of E versus S, but I'm tired of Africa being a follower. And I think Africa must find an opportunity to leapfrog. And this crisis that the world is facing, where yes, we are 16% of the world, but we only contribute of less than 1% of this problem we're facing of climate change. But is our success in resolving the issues around S by following the journey that the developed world followed, which we know they are struggling with? I'm not so sure. I was saying to my colleagues at the end of last month, saying, humanity did not end Stone Age because they ran out of stones. They found better ways of doing things. And I'm more excited by green energy than by oil. Although I welcome it, but I'm more excited by green energy. The reason I am is, if Africa can solve that problem and leapfrog our people from working in coal mines straight into green energy without taking them via oil, we would have leapfrogged the world from being behind to being ahead. I am worried by following the journey already followed, because when they move from that journey to the next, we are going to remain behind. So I think we must put our minds together and find a way of leapfrogging. And as I come to use my 60 seconds now, as you promised when I was sitting here that you're going to ask me to respond to what Sarah said, Old Mutual must digitalize. I want to share that Logan Fransman and his team have digitalized the equivalent of what they say it in minutes, 8 million minutes per year in terms of robotized within Old Mutual. But it doesn't excite me at the same time, because I say, we have 50% unemployment of this youth and I'm busy robotizing. And it becomes a difficult challenge for me. Sarah showed us the top 10, whether it's S&P or Dow Jones, I don't know, of 1990. And by 2020, not one of them was still there. And I'm saying, at what point are we going to upskill our people again to be able to be digital? And that's one thing that we are still lacking in the nation. But if you were listening in the news last month, you realize Minion Dupree launched the My Old Mutual app. So if you want to claim on your funeral policy or check where your unit trusts are sitting, just go download the My Old Mutual app. You can do any trading you want, any of your transactions, any of your funeral claims from your sofa. So we are busy trying to digitalize the business, and hopefully I believe at some point it will result in fees. But at the moment, we're still spending the money developing the future. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude our panel discussion. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists for contributing their diversity of views and opinions, and some fascinating points raised. Thank you very much for being here. Please give them a round of applause.
You've been listening to a special rebroadcast of a panel discussion held at the Old Mutual Investment Summit 2023. Panelists included Tassius Chigariro, the Old Mutual Group CEO, Sarah Mazui-Ngo, the Head of Alternative Investments at the GIPF, Benedict Labanda, the CEO of the Environmental Investment Fund, Roland Brown, Founder and Director of Cirrus Capital, and Nicole Martins, the Head of Stewardship at Old Mutual South Africa. I'm Gary Struble, and I was the facilitator. You can catch this specific recording again in our podcast streams, wherever you pick up your podcasts, on Apple or Android or Spotify. You'll find this there. This special broadcast was proudly brought to you by Old Mutual.